Okay, we can get started. We do a little bit of introductions in the beginning anyways. So welcome to Storytelling via SciArt, Crafting an Audio Story. I'm Shane with my co-hosts Olivia and special guest Jackson. I'm just going to start with introductions and all of that. But before we really even get rolling, I want to poll all of you just to get a feeling of where everyone's at. So I'm going to launch a poll here that you all should hopefully see. Someone voted. There we go. So yeah, just how confident do you currently feel to communicate via audio? It's a podcast or music, or do you use sound and written documents or whatever it might be? Are you using audio in the way you communicate science? While that's up, Olivia already wrote this in the chat, but if you have questions throughout, there's a little Q&A box in your dashboard where you can ask questions. So please feel free to do that. We will get to questions at the end. We'll have some dedicated time to do that. Yes, I always forget to write this. 1 is not very confident and 5 is very confident. Thank you. I think in the survey afterwards, 5 is very confident. Yes. I appreciate y'all for checking me on that. No matter how many times I do this, I still forget. All right, seems like folks are rounding up their votes. I'll give it a few more seconds. All right. Okay, so somewhere in the middle bottom. And then that's great. So no matter what your confidence is, no matter where you are at right now, there will be something in this for everyone. So let's get into it. So first, very briefly, background on us. Some of you have been to some of our webinars before. If you haven't, we are part of the American Geophysical Union. We're a big Earth and Space Science Society, a bunch of journals, conferences, big one every year. Within that, though, is what we specifically Olivia and myself do. We are the Sharing Science program, and our whole goal is to help scientists mostly communicate better to really any sort of audience through any sort of medium, and audio is one of those. And we do that through a number of ways. We have workshops. We do this really big webinar series every year. We have a bunch of resources. So if you're here for audio, welcome. If you're here for audio as part of a larger science communication thing, that's what we do. So we hope you'll check out some of our other stuff. I mentioned this is part of a larger storytelling series. So we're in kind of I guess right in the middle at this point of it for this year. We did a few on just general storytelling. We have we have all these resources recorded and a bunch of supplemental resources. So if you missed any of our previous recordings, any of our previous webinars, we will be providing follow-up information on how to access those. We have a final one in this kind of storytelling via multimedia one, which is all about communicating via film. We're going to hear from some great science filmmakers. And then we have a handful more that we are currently scheduling that's going to be storytelling to kind of other unique audiences. So you can find old ones. We hope you'll stick with us and register for future ones. The person who's been talking to you, I'm Shane Hanlon. I am, like I said, in the Sharing Science program. My specific relation to audio is that I am, for all intents and purposes, executive producer of both of AGU's podcasts and host/co-host on both of those podcasts. So I have audio is a big part of my job, let's say. So I'll be talking all about podcasting as well. Olivia, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Ambrogio. Also draw self-portraits of myself as vegetables from time to time, as who doesn't. My background is much less in audio, although I am involved with the Third Pod from the Sun podcast, more on the storytelling side. So happy to provide additional resources as I can.
And then we're excited to have Jackson Watkins. Jackson, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. My name is Jackson Watkins. I'm a former graduate student at Colorado State University and now a research associate, and soon to be a grad student again at Northwestern University. And I have been in smaller underground music scenes for almost the last decade, which it kind of almost hurts me to say. It's been so long. But I just do a lot of music recording. I used to be in radio and engineering, mixing, and mastering music mostly. So
Yeah, and we're excited to have Jackson to kind of give I guess, a not as common way that specifically folks in the sciences use audio to talk about science, specifically through music. So like I said, I'm going to be talking mostly about podcasts. And at this point, because we want to, even though we can't see you, we want to hear from you, I'm launching another poll here. So has anyone been involved in podcasting, either from the hosting production side, so you've been part of a team or you are a person that makes a podcast, or have you been interviewed for a podcast? Because we're going to briefly touch on that as well. It's important to know what's expected of you to be interviewed or not at all. And again, that's fine as well. That's what we're here for. And be sure to check out the chat as well. Olivia is going to be posting all sorts of links throughout. If you see something on the screen and there's no link to it, it will likely appear there. And if it doesn't, we follow up with pretty extensive emails with a bunch of information afterwards. So we make sure that even if you miss this 1 hour, you can get all the other good stuff. All right, so we're about a minute. I'm going to end this one. And all right, so majority of you haven't done anything like this. We're happy you're here. And for those of you who have been on either side of the microphone, as it were, we hope that you can pull some things out of this. So I wanted to start with planning. With any sort of communication, podcast, music, talking to school groups, whatever it might be, we really need to think about what we're doing, why we're doing it, that type of thing. And podcasting in particular, I think is really, really important because there are a boatload of podcasts out there and a lot of science podcasts out there. Like I said, HU is 2, but each time we were very deliberate in the planning process for these. Like, should we do this? Is there an audience? What's our goal? Why are we doing it? What do we want to do? Who are we talking to? Who is our audience? So thinking about just like, should you do this to begin with is really important because even some of the more bare bones podcasts do require time and energy, but they can be really rewarding on the other side of that. And there's some interesting data out there on podcasts. There was this really big comprehensive study done examining podcasts for over a decade, frankly, within the science realm. And specifically what I want you all to see here, though, is that a lot of people who start podcasts, specifically science podcasts, they start off really strong. Like, we're going to do this. We're going to do a bunch of episodes. We're going to keep it going forever. And there's a long tail here. So folks start it and it's either too much or they don't have the resources or whatever it might be. There's not a lot of longevity here. And again, that's okay. You can always start something and stop it. But this is where the planning part comes into is really important because it's the one thing, like, I want to be doing this podcast for, 10 years, right? Okay, think about that versus I'm going to start this and see where it goes. And that's okay as well. And there are, like I said, there are a ton of science podcasts out there. If you just go to like the science section this is through Apple, this is like what shows up. Science is squishy. The word science is squishy when it comes to podcasting, because there are some podcasts out there that aren't science, that are in the science category, and some that are questionable, more about just general learning and curiosity. And that's fantastic, but maybe not what, and I'm not gatekeeping science either, but maybe not what we would think about with like science, like not like natural sciences, for example, which is what my background is. And this is not a new thing. So we did another podcasting webinar, like 3 or 4 years ago now. And this was from then, same thing. So what folks define as science podcast is kind of squishy, but that is to say that what you might want to do with a science podcast, there's a lot of directions you can go with it, whether that's on the actual science, the research, whether that's the people, whether that's careers, whether that's representation, like whatever it might be, there are so many different options here. And podcasts are still somehow becoming more and more popular. More and more people are listening to podcasts, even though we have more and more podcasts out there. This is the most recent. Pew does this poll or the survey every year. So this is like 2019, 2020, the most recent one, and it just keeps going up, 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 up. So that's really great if you're interested in kind of broadening your audience. And there's a lot of interesting statistics out there on podcasts in general. Decent chunk of specifically Americans, because this is the data we have, listen to podcasts. It's interesting, this kind of percentage you see in this figure, that 6% of overall audio listened to is podcasts. And now 6% isn't huge, but it's contending against music and talk radio and all sorts of other things. So that percentage is growing. And so we know actually a decent amount about, again, kind of big buckets of folks who listen to podcasts, who these people are. But frankly, all sorts of people do. And there are a lot of reasons why we should use podcasts to communicate, especially communicate science. They're economical to produce. I'm going to run through some of the tech later, or I guess in a minute or two. But you can do a podcast for relatively low budget, or frankly, no budget for at least a few episodes or so. They're really convenient. They're on your phone, in your ears. If you're like a lab scientist, or maybe a field scientist, or you're just commuting to your job, or just out walking the dog, or walking around the house, or whatever it might be, you can have podcasts in your ears. You get consistent engagement because you can get subscribers who will automatically download or automatically listen to the next episode. It's like television series, except even kind of more convenient because you can just download it straight to your phone. And audio, I feel, because I'm partial, audio provides a level of intimacy that some other mediums don't. Because audio, they can really invoke visuals, right? Gets the, in this case, listener to create a scene in their mind. Audio is not great at conveying scale. That's just how it is. You can't see this thing. But it gets a good sense of the feeling, right? Like if you were to close your eyes and say something like, "The forest seemed to stretch on forever," we're all envisioning probably something different, but we're all sharing in that experience of creating that vision. And that can be a really powerful thing with audio. Specifically with podcasts, folks are using them to teach, to help learn as part of pedagogy. They're in the classroom, whether that's from K through 12 or in college or whatever it might be. You can use podcasts as another way of learning, especially, frankly, in this past year. People have found the benefits in using different ways of learning. You could use them for expanding your reach. There is nothing wrong with self-promotion, not a single thing. Be your own best advocate, and you can use that as a way to get your work or yourself or your group or folks in your field or whatever it might be out there to audiences who might not normally know what you're doing or have a sense of what it's like to, for example, be a scientist. And it seems that folks are generally interested in reaching kind of non-science audiences. So this is from that original survey, or that study that I mentioned earlier with the tales. When you ask folks who are podcasting about science, who they're trying to reach, for the most part, they're trying to reach like what we call the public. That's a big omnibus term that I don't really agree with, but essentially non-scientists, folks who don't have science in their bones, who aren't practicing science, whatever that might mean. They're trying to reach broader audiences, and we at AGU, for the most part, are no different in that. We include scientists in our members and folks in that group, but yeah, we're trying to make it accessible to reach out to broader audiences. So this is still all about the planning process, because before you do any of this, any sort of communication, think about why you are doing it. Like, what do you want to get out of this? Think about who your audience is. What do you think they want to get out of this? Or what do you want them to get out of this? And then again, to the best of your abilities, or at least you can think about, okay, I want to target this audience. Who are they? What are their values? What are their interests, their concerns? What do they really care about? And this can really help you shape not only the content that you might put out there, but frankly, also just expectations, because not everyone's goals and outcomes are going to be the same. So that's just a really practical thing. So that's all of the stuff that we suggest thinking about before you even do the thing, or think about what equipment you're going to need or how you're going to do it. So podcasts are all about recording. You need to record in some capacity. And this goes to tech. But one thing, and I think this is true for, frankly, a lot of mediums, good technique with meh gear is so much better than bad technique with great gear. You can only fix things or only fix so much after the fact. So if you're recording and you have a really fancy microphone and your microphone's over here, that doesn't work. You need to be using good technique, and good technique totally outweighs bad technique with good gear. So you can do this on a budget and have really good quality. And there are, no matter what your setup is, and we're going to run through some setups, there are certain tricks that always work. Things like pop filters, so filters that go over your microphone to prevent things like peas from popping, to really having that explosive sound in your ear. Getting a room print, which is just recording what your room sounds like a few seconds beforehand, because that's something you can remove. Like if you have an air conditioner running, you can remove that in post-production. Getting really close to the microphone. Like my microphone's right here. I'm this far away from it. Like we call it eating the mic. There are all sorts of different tips. Transom has some really great ones. And frankly, this is going to be silly, but Google's a great resource. There are so many places out there that have great resources on good technique. So I'm going to quickly run through tech because there's literally thousands of different ways to record things. But just starting at the most basic level, we all, or I'd say almost all of us, have a recorder. If you have a phone, you have a microphone. That's fantastic. It's an easy thing to use. Microphones and phones are fine if you're just wanting to dabble to start off. There are some quick ways you can improve on this. There are a lot of microphones out there made to plug directly into phones. So I actually have this Shure one. It's this. I have a little pop filter on it. It's really great. It's fantastic. It improves the quality dramatically, but your your phone has a microphone. And if you have any sort of earbuds or headphones or whatever, the microphone on those, even if it's just the stock ones that come with your phone, is pretty good. So again, a lot of us have this in our pockets or on us already. There are also specialized things out there. There are recorders that reporters use frequently. You can get a really fancy condenser microphone. This Shure microphone is one of the most common ones in any sort of recording. Jackson and I actually talked about this. Like we both have this microphone for audio and like for podcasting and for recording music. I use this one. It's one that plugs in directly to my computer. I don't know, this microphone costs like $100. I do this professionally, so make that investment. But yeah, you can do this for really cheap as well. It really runs the gamut. Recording's the same way. You can have all sorts of fancy equipment. You can have mixers in this really fancy recording studio and all of that jazz. You can use handheld recorders. For Third Pod from the Sun, for one of our podcasts, we have a handful of these that are really great because we can record sound in the room. We can plug microphones directly into them. Again, we do this professionally, so you don't need any of this stuff, but there are a lot of options out there. But this goes back to kind of this idea of technique is arguably more important than the really fancy tech. If you are recording for, say, a podcast, try to put yourself in a space that's dead end, like the walls are dead end. You might hear an echo in the space I'm in right now. I'm in my office. I'm recording this for a webinar. I'm not recording this for the podcast, so that's okay. But literally, if you shove yourself in a closet and put blankets over you, it's silly, but it makes a big difference. You reduce that echo, you reduce a lot of that noise that folks don't really like to hear. Putting your microphone on a stand, putting a pop filter in front of it, like these are all really important things because like that gets picked up on a recording. We don't want that. So remember this, no matter what your microphone is, if it's a phone or it's really fancy, your mic is lava. Don't touch it, just set it, forget it. It'll really help out. This was my setup when I first started recording from home during the pandemic. This is literally this closet that I set up and put pillows all around me, and it worked just fine. I've graduated, and again, I do this professionally, but this is all you need, and it can work really, really well. It's a relatively basic setup. And you see here too, again, where it's a webinar, and for whatever reason, I can't pick up closed captioning if I have headphones on. But if you use headphones as well, so you're not getting kind of that feedback. I have like really fancy headphones, but just your headphones that plug into your phone that come stock with it work really well as well. There's all sorts of different ways to record. We live in the Zoom environment. Zoom allows you to record. It's a fine function. It works out pretty well. There are dedicated software. We use this thing called Squadcast that's made for audio, so you can do that as well. You can record things on your phone. I have an iPhone, but you can record just into your audio app, and that works as well. There are recording programs that either come with your computer or are free. The bottom left one is GarageBand, which comes on all Macs. If you don't have a Mac, that's fine. There's a free program out there called Audacity that is fan-frickin-tastic and has some really great tutorials. Every single time you open it up, this little pop-up box comes up and you can learn something new. Used Audacity for probably the first couple years of doing this type of stuff. So that's planning, that's execution. I'm going to kind of round out my section with, okay, well, how do you edit? And this is fun because you're getting to see like a little bit of what's on my phone. I'm also a storyteller, so I have fun stories recorded on my phone. But if you're recording things on your phone, there are some limited things you can do just with the native apps. So something like an iPhone, you can open it in just the audio editor and you can trim it. So at the very least, you can pull out the beginning awkward sound of where you're introducing yourself and pull out the end where you're tailing off, just so you have the meat of your story or whatever you're recording. So that's really helpful. Again, if you have, I'm more familiar with Apple products. If you have an iPhone, you automatically have GarageBand natively on your phone. So you can get a little bit more into the weeds here, or if you have like any sort of Apple product, and I know that there are PC equivalents as well. So there just might be something that came with your device. And you can also record through that app, through just like your voice memos app, and then upload it to some sort of audio editing software. So you can use a mix of what you have, and all of it can be free. Record on your native app on your phone, upload it into Audacity. These things are all free, and they all work pretty well. You can record on your computer as well. Like I said, Audacity is a fantastic product. I cannot recommend it enough, especially if you're just starting out. And again, lots of great tutorials out there. We've made some really great sounding stuff using Audacity. I've graduated to Adobe Audition. Again, we have that through AGU, which is awesome. Don't need it, but can definitely use it. And I like it a lot because I have it. But yeah, you probably can't tell the episodes we've made with Audacity versus Audition. It's just kind of a user's preference at this point. If you are recording podcasts or recording sounds for anything, there are lots of places to get. You can either do this yourself, you can record B-roll. So this is just extra sounds, whether that's like in the environment or in your lab, or just things to complement whatever your story is, to add them in to make the story more maybe engaging or more like attractive to listeners. But there are lots of places out there that have sounds that you can either get for free or most of the times pay a small fee for. Lots and lots of repositories out there. Buzzsprout is a really great resource to find some of these things. So definitely suggest checking that out. There are all sorts of places you can host podcasts. Many of us, if not most of us, have heard of SoundCloud, but there's also kind of these dedicated audio servers, things like Podbean and Blueberry and Lisbon, because all of these names have to be named something. These are great because it's where your audio is hosted, and then you can post it in a bunch of different places. We use Blueberry for AGU. And then you can also just put it on a website. We host things on this server, and then we will put them on our website later, like basically link to the server. But you can also just natively put things on your website. Just paste it in there as an audio file, and you can get free websites as well. So again, all of these are low-cost options. Like I said, we have this podcast. We have an artist as well for this one we do called Scientell, and we can ship the content there. We have the same thing for ThirdPod, but we also have a SoundCloud with ThirdPod. And again, you can upload files directly to SoundCloud. They're free up until a point. So it might be a nice way to experiment with SoundCloud, or experiment if you're just thinking about, I don't know how long I'm going to keep doing this. You can start there, and it's free. And lots of people have SoundCloud and know what SoundCloud is. So that's kind of the planning and the execution and the tech and all of that. Just some things to note. It can be an investment. There are some challenges with podcasting. So convincing people to listen to podcasts in general, even though it's growing and there's lots more people doing it, folks are inundated. Frankly, there's a lot of people out there listening to a lot of different things. There are all sorts of different apps and opportunities and everything. So that can be a challenge. Building an audience can really be a challenge. Lots of listener saturation. I say technology and production in here, but again, you can start out relatively low. But just all this is to say that, and Olivia and I were joking about this the other day. It's like Shane's basic thing. It's like, so you want to start a podcast? Well, maybe you shouldn't. I don't believe, and I bring this up because I don't believe that. I think that just being very deliberate and really thinking about it is going to just be really beneficial. I love podcasting so much more than I ever anticipated I would. But I was apprehensive when we first started, and I'm so happy we did. But knowing a lot of the stuff going in really helped me not only to tackle some of these tasks, but also just be kind of real about why am I doing this? And I care about listenership and our audience and all of that, but I also really enjoy doing it. So I'm happy with that. And that's my expectation. One last thing I wanted to touch on before I kick it over to Jackson is just talked a lot about how to create a podcast. Some of you said that you had been a guest, and maybe you know this already, and that's fantastic. But there are some really small things that you can do as a guest on a podcast, especially if you're being interviewed at home, as most of us probably are at this point. I mentioned the quiet room with soft stuff in it. It really helps deaden the sound. Make sure if you're using an external mic, whether that's a professional mic or one in your headphones or whatever, that you just check the settings beforehand. So it's either not too quiet or too loud, because again, those are really hard things to fix afterwards. If you just have your computer microphone, that works too, but don't type while you're using it. Don't do anything else. You can really pick those things up on a microphone, any sort of microphone. Remember, the mic is lava type thing. Like, you don't want to have any sort of hair or clothing or jewelry or anything that might touch the microphone. If you were recording with a back and forth conversation, wear headphones. Again, I'm not doing it for this instance, but the webinars are different than recording. And frankly, if you are being interviewed and it's an episode and it goes out or whatever, promote it. Like, show off to colleagues, your Twitter following, whoever, like, hey, I did this thing. Because it might seem that sometimes these podcasts are really big industries and whatever, or they have this huge following. Maybe they do, but they also really appreciate when you promote it as well to your networks, because that can not only help boost your profile, but can help boost their profile as well. So I have a couple examples. I'm actually going to skip over these for a second. Let us get to Jackson, and we'll come back to examples at the end, depending on how much time we have. So one last thing for me before I go. I asked about podcasting. Has anyone done podcasting before? I'm going to ask the same thing about music. So have any of you done any sort of science music, like at all, recorded in person, an open mic night, doing something at AGU's fall meeting if you've been there, just out of curiosity? All right, so it seems like voting's leveling off. I'll give it a few more seconds. And okay, so 13% of you said yes. That is 13% more than I thought would say yes. So that's pretty cool. But if you haven't done any of this before, That's what Jackson is here for. So Jackson, I'm going to hand control over to you, and you can take it away. And Jackson, you are muted.
Yes, I am. All right, yeah. So the cool thing about that poll, I think, is that I'm broadly going to talk about music, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about connecting to a community and the things that you create individually and figuring out a way to put those out into a world or into the world in a way that seems authentic to you. So I think some of these themes, at least, hopefully can be more broadly applied to whatever art space you're in, but definitely it's going to be mostly music. So I'm going to talk about being in a band, how I decided eventually to connect that to the science that I was doing, because it hadn't initially started that way for me, and kind of what that looked like for me. And a lot of like what my musical journey has ended up becoming, so to speak. I want to emphasize that I'm not an authority on this. I'm not in like an insanely popular band. And I think that's actually really important to the fundamentals of like creating music for yourself and your community. We presented at AGU a couple of years ago about connecting with small audiences and the value that there is in connecting to smaller audiences or local community audiences, and how valuable that can be. And music is, in my opinion, one of the best ways to do that in a community, or broadly. It's all about what your goals are going to be with it. But and all that said, I've found really genuine connections through music, and it's something that's been really important to me. And that has happened with the context of science and without the context of science. So I think it's a great way to communicate science, and I kind of want to focus on that today. And also a little bit more of the specifics, engineering, mixing, and mastering. Shane covered a lot of that, so my topic on that will be fairly brief, but I am going to cover the differences as well with that. Let's see if I can. Cool. I wanted to start with an approach. Your approach towards making any kind of art form is always going to be a really important thing to think out, even though admittedly we don't a lot of the time, and sometimes that leads to something beautiful. But thinking about what you want to do with music, I think, is really important. So something you can think about broadly before music is which communities you normally exist in with and without, or within and without science. This picture to the right is actually an old band I was in. This is a picture we took on tour, that was taken of us on tour in Olympia, Washington. It was something I did on the side during the summers when I was an undergrad and during breaks. So we would take a few months out on the road and perform on the weekends and stuff like that. But it was never something that I had connected to science in any way. I mean, some of the things I'd learned in class could like made their way into the vocals or into the lyrics, but there was no like intentionality with the connection of the music to the science. And they weren't really worlds that I thought had any overlap for a long time. They were kind of just separate things that I did. And I think as you continue in your quote unquote career in science, I think something that a lot of us do is recognize that science is something we're passionate about, and it ends up being a little bit more of like a job, more than a job for us. And we get very involved in it and put a lot of time into it. And so I think as that started to develop, as I became a graduate student, I kind of was more interested in like the ways that those things could overlap, and those aspects of my life could overlap. And I think that's where intentionality comes into it, which is like setting goals, but not in like a hyperbolic way or in a way that's too lofty. Just like recognizing what you want to do with music. And I started this band with some friends of mine called Yale that existed kind of in the same music spaces that my old bands that didn't do anything related to science were in. And we wanted to like start bringing in themes of science, or I did, especially being a scientist, but wanted to connect those things in a way that wasn't just like, I am the science communicator in the room. I am the authority on microbes or infectious diseases, which is what I was studying at the time. And that was a really important thing to me. It was like connecting to the community through other themes, broader themes than science. And that's where that silly headline that is actually still like one of my favorite headlines that was written about us in the Collegian, which is our school newspaper. But I think something that actually came out of that was really cool is that the songs were about science, but they were also about connecting science to things like being overworked as a graduate student and feeling the blowback of that, or seeing systemic issues in science, especially in the way that communities of people have been oppressed by science over the last 100 or 200 years in the United States, for example, and kind of bringing all those things together as a person who is doing science. And I think a lot of those themes are more relatable than just setting out to be the science communicator. I do think those have value, and especially in an educational context. But this was just kind of like our approach to it, I guess. And then being yourself, which is really cheesy, but if you're making art, you know, you want it to feel authentic. You want it to be something that is personal to you, and people are going to connect with that. And I've definitely found that in like small spaces, is that we talk about the science a lot, and we table science-focused zines, and we distribute science information at our shows for free, which is something that's really important to the band. But a lot of the things that we connect with are not actually related to the science. A lot of the conversations I have after shows or on tour are about other themes in the music, and then they kind of relate back to the science. And I just think that's a really cool thing that artistic mediums give you the capability to do, is all. It's very general, because you also have to figure this out for yourself and what that looks like for you, because everybody's different. So it's a hard thing to like give advice on, but it's something that's been important to me. And then just not overemphasizing. Again, this goes back, Shane and I, or actually Shane brought up a really cool phrase that I thought of, or that he thought of, I guess, is like, don't hit people over the head with your science. And I think that was a really great way to put it. Like, you don't have to overemphasize who you are as a scientist to like still connect with people. And I'll show you some examples of that in a few slides. But sometimes it's better to just be a person because people connect with people who also does science, because everybody's an individual and does cool art things or things on the side or whatever. So anyway, a little bit more technical, less philosophical, I guess, is the engineering, mixing and mastering, because music can be a little bit more difficult than podcasting, in the sense that the technical side of it tends to be a little bit more complex. That said, some of the first pieces of music that I ever put out into the world were literally all recorded one mic, iPhone live, mixed and mastered in like 20 minutes, and then just put into the world. So it's not to say you can't create art just literally, or music literally recorded on your phone and put into the world. But sometimes it doesn't involve more complex setups. And on the left, you can see this picture of my friend Jake when we were recording one of our albums a few years ago. There's all these mics set up on the drums. The room is soundproofed with these carpet panels on the wall. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is still a garage. It's still our friend Austin's garage. It's still kind of haphazardly thrown everywhere because the space is small, and it takes a lot of adjusting. But you can do this by yourself, and especially if you want to put a little bit of money into it, you can buy mics, and you can buy digital or audio interfaces to plug into your computer and make art if you're or make music if you're a person that wants to do that. The middle image is our friend Austin. That's him mixing and engineering our album as we were recording it. He has a thing on there right underneath his computer that's called an audio interface. That's where you plug the microphones into. These can be as simple as like 2 microphone, $120 Focusrite interfaces, or you can go up to like 9 input interfaces. I mean, there's kind of like a large spectrum of different things and equipment you can buy. And these are all things you can Google as well if you're interested in recording at this level. As Shane had mentioned, Google really is your friend. And most of what we learned was from Google. So it's a really good reference to just figure out what you need to make music. And then your digital audio workstation, your DAW, your DAW, which is on the right, is also important. And again, Shane had mentioned Audacity. Audacity is great. We tend not to use it as much for music just because it's harder when you get like above like 10 or 12 tracks. It can be a little bit more difficult to work with in my experience, at least. But GarageBand is great and free. And there are other free DAWs out there. This one is called Reaper. I actually like it a lot. It used to be free, which kind of sucks. It's like $250 now for a license, I think. But well worth it in my experience, and very common amongst amateur musicians like myself. And so I just wanted to show a few examples of sort of how our science manifested in the music. The flyer on the left is one that I had made for a show I booked for my friend Nick. Nick is kind of like he's just like he's like one of those people that has a bunch of friends. So a bunch of people ended up coming to the show, and he played in all 4 bands. And I was tasked with making the flyer. And it's from my immunology textbook. I was an undergraduate at the time, and I had just cut all those images out and got a surprising amount of questions about what all of that meant. And it was just kind of like a fun way to integrate science into like the promotion of our music, even though it had almost nothing to do with the show itself. You still get asked questions, and I think that was really funny. And the middle one is another example of a flyer I made. I was telling Shane and Olivia this story yesterday, but I was taking this exam, and if any of you are familiar with Artemis for gene analysis of DNA, part of the exam, the take-home exam, was to analyze a few sequences that we had gotten, and I was frustrated and I couldn't finish the exam, and I needed to make this flyer like that night, and so I just literally screenshotted my homework assignment or my exam assignment and overlaid the text over it. And again, got tons of questions about what that was and why it was there. And it was just a stupid excuse to talk about this exam that I'd done poorly on. And then a little bit more intentionality on the right. Yale is my most recent project, and the image on the top right is the 3 of us just in lab coats. We snuck into the lab I was working in at the time, and took a few pictures in the lab because we thought the aesthetic was a little bit nicer at night. And that was kind of a way that we promoted ourselves. And that, again, was a little bit more intentional, right? Like we're literally just standing there in lab coats and taking pictures all over a lab. And then at the bottom there, the imagery is pretty in your face, I guess, as far as science goes. It's an e-flask with flowers in it and some undescribed liquid. But yeah, again, it's just like an excuse to talk to people about science. And then when they listen to the songs, you can see those themes in the songs as well. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Jackson. So I'm going to arrest control back from you. So I'm going to play just a couple things before we get into questions. So we have this series called AGU Rocks, which I'll talk about in a second, but Jackson was one of our early contributors. And so I'm going to play a clip from one of his songs. And then we have lots of these examples, but I just want to go backwards to play a clip from one of our podcasts. And you can see we use, this is another webinar, but we use this little software called Headliner to make these little audiograms, which are really great. We can make these 1-minute excerpts. But this is from our Scientel podcast.
For me, I think the biggest hurdle is communication skills, surprisingly. Coming from like a first generation grad student background, because I'm the first in my family to go to grad school, being a teen mom, and having some communication difficulties. A few months ago, I found out that I'm autistic, and now a lot of things are starting to make sense. One of the reasons why I applied to be in the Voices for Science program, which is a science communication program with the American Geophysical Union. But one of the reasons why I first applied for that program was because I felt like whatever I was saying never really came across quite right, and I wasn't able to effectively communicate what I needed to.
And so, yeah, that's just some excerpts, but you can hear that we take audio pretty seriously when it comes to quality. But again, we have the resources, whether that's a personal interest or professional interest. but you don't need, I can't reiterate this enough, you don't need super fancy tech to do this pretty well. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to do some just wrap up stuff, and then we'll get to some questions. So you can, I'm going to put the slide back, but you can find Jackson and his music from Yale through the social medias. You can find me as well through the social medias, and all of my stuff connects back to the podcast and HU and Sharing Science. My personal and professional profiles are pretty intertwined. HU podcasts. So both of our podcasts come through this Twitter account, and you can go to the websites as well. I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. So if you miss any of this, we will be following up via email with all of you in the coming weeks. I mentioned this HU Rocks thing. So we have a blog series that highlights a lot of stuff, but a couple series or a few series on the arts. And one of them is HU Rocks. And so if you are part of that 13% who writes music and has any sort of like a science focus to it, we want to hear from you. We want to have you contribute your piece or pieces to showcase the great stuff that you do, but also to talk about your process, because we think that if you're lowering the barriers to show people how you do this thing, then more people will do it and more people will share it. So again, we have a bunch of links and URLs. Olivia's throwing them into the chat right now. Check it out and just contact us if you have any questions. We have all of the social medias. I'll reiterate this one. And with that, we will take questions, and I'll go back to, actually, I'll leave it here for now while we talk. And so, Olivia, have you been getting questions for us?
Yeah, there are a ton of really great questions. Many of them focused more on podcasting, but I know that both of you can answer those questions since you've both done podcasting. One good one was, when you're interviewing someone else for a podcast, how much research should you do for questions ahead of time? How prepared do you need to be in advance versus how much do you just sort of respond to things in the moment?
Yeah, I might be actually a pretty good person to talk about this. So I am not a journalist with my background. I'm a hard scientist who's now a communicator. And I actually struggle with this. We have journalists, colleagues who are on the Third Pod staff who are awesome interviewers. And so for me, I do a lot of research because I want to have, most of our interviews are an hour, let's say, and I want to have at least a half dozen hard questions that I can pull out of the hat to know where I'm going. And I try to map, like if the interview was only going to be these questions, I try to map a story. So who they are, what they do, how they got into what they do, anything surprising, highs and lows, fails, adversity, like that type of thing. So that if nothing organic comes out of the conversation, it's still mapped really well. So for me personally, I like to have more research than I probably need. And with anything else, the more that I've, like for anything that we do, the more that I've done it, the better I've gotten at being able to ask questions off the cuff. So I think more research is better if you are not a naturally gifted interviewer. If you are, then go for it. But I would say be more prepared than not. And then if you get to follow up and have really fun avenues that you didn't anticipate exploring, like that's gravy. That's really good extra stuff.
We have a couple more questions about sort of the podcast like tips and tools, let's say. So one being how frequently one should plan to put out episodes, especially if you're trying to build up a new audience, and also how you determine what an optimal length is for a podcast episode.
I'll just note, Jackson had a podcast as well at some point. So Jackson, if at any point you want to pop in, please do. I'll mention the second one first. So how long should a podcast be? There is no rule. The adage used to be that the ideal podcast for a person is how long their commute is. So if your commute is a 10-minute drive, walk, whatever to work, that's your ideal podcast length. If you're stuck in traffic for hours or on the subway or whatever, that's how long your ideal podcast length is. So, I mean, if the only thing I can say that is if you're targeting you're targeting certain age demographics, like if you're targeting, say, younger audiences, the younger audiences likely have shorter attention spans. And I'm not like, there are statistics to back this up. But so there might be something there, but honestly, do what you want and do what you think you would want to listen to, because you are going to be an audience for your podcast as well. The other one, oh, how frequent? So this is tough. We are wrestling with this a lot, actually. In my experience, the promotion, at least starting out, matters a little bit more than how often things are actually getting put out. So what I mean by that is the Scientell podcast we have is relatively new. We only have 4 episodes published, but when we publish them, we have X number of subscribers, but we end up getting multitudes more listeners. And that's because we have a more regular marketing schedule, a more regular promotion schedule. So I think promoting things on a regular basis is really important. So whether that's if you're releasing a podcast, I don't know, monthly, making sure over the course of that entire month that you're promoting that podcast so that eyes are getting on it more and more and more. Again, there's no real science for regularity. If you can do something like a weekly, good on ya. I'd say monthly is probably the minimum, or you can do the season thing, which a lot of folks are doing now, put out a half dozen, 10 episodes over the course of maybe a couple months, and then come back to it a few months later. And so that way you'll have a lot of stuff coming out regularly, but the onus isn't on you for an entire year to do that. You can kind of do it in spurts.
Well, and let me come back to that for both of you, Jackson and Shane, for any kind of audio or sort of product that you have. What kind of promotion do you recommend? How do you like for you, Jackson, how did you increase, attendance at concerts and listenership and all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of that for us comes from both social media and community connections. So if you can build like a network, sounds like such a professional word, but I think it's the right word. If you can build like folks who you're regularly going to shows with, or regularly creating podcasts with, or just building like connections with people who are doing similar things. Oftentimes there'll be overlap between maybe you're going on their show, or maybe you're playing shows with them. And I think that's the best way to do it, honestly, is just getting to know people that do what you want to do, honestly, because most people like want to talk about themselves, I think. So you can strike up conversation, but then you can maybe get involved with them in some way. The other aspect of that is definitely social media. I'm not a huge fan of making social media pages for every single creative outlet you have. But if your goal is to like promote your band, for example, like what we do is mostly Instagram. Twitter is a pretty good place to promote music right now as well. But building some kind of like social media platform that you regularly post on, maybe once a week, is really great for that. And especially when shows were up and running, Instagram stories were a great way to connect people to links to the show. And Facebook, unfortunately, was a really good way to do that, although that's waning in popularity a lot, I think. I think Instagram and Twitter are pretty much the best way to kind of like promote shows. So it's going to be a mix of those two things, meeting people as well in your community who are doing what you do, and promoting your stuff on Instagram or Twitter, I think are probably the best ways to build an audience for me.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that community piece. You can do that online too. I mean, direct emails to friends, colleagues, peers, whatever, direct messages to people on Twitter, posting in communities, listservs, messaging groups, whatever you might be involved with. It's especially on social media, it's really easy for other people to ignore things. You're like, oh, I don't know, like this is too much. Like, no, they're ignoring so much that it's not like it's not onerous on them. It's not, oh my gosh, this guy again. Because it's just like everything else, but there's a chance something might catch their eye. So use those communities, use those groups that you belong to.
Yeah, I would say, and I'd say don't be like a jerk or persistent, but honestly, you'd be surprised at how easy it is to like just reach out to people and make a connection. Like Shane said, like a good example I think for me is like I put out this science focused zine not too long ago, and it was literally just a product of me reaching out to someone who had a slightly bigger platform and being like, "Hey, I have this idea. Would you want to publish this for me?" And it worked really well. Um, and I think that's Shane brought up a really good point. I just wanted to add that on. Like, don't be afraid to like ask people if you want to collaborate or do something cool. They might say no or ignore you, and that's fine. But
And then there've been a few questions too about the fact that, you know, it was brought up that with podcasts, you know, a lot of it is often, or music generally, right? A lot of this is often volunteer effort. I mean, Shane, you and I, we work for an organization that puts out podcasts. That's a little bit different, but in general, you know, nobody's being paid for this. Do either of you have recommendations in terms of whether there are like funding opportunities out there related to podcasts, or any sort of suggestions around getting a little bit of compensation or reimbursement for the time and effort that is put in?
So from the podcast world, there Google's your friend. There are opportunities for folks who do podcasts. I know NPR every year offers some sort of like academy for resources on podcasting. I'm positive some of the big like podcasting resources or even media schools or whatever do that type of thing. Maybe even, I mean, if you're thinking about doing something for your department or university or sciencey, wherever your institution might be, if you are a scientist, maybe just even asking around, like maybe your comms office might have something, or maybe this is something that a colleague or an advisor or someone might have been interested in. And again, like Jackson said, different topic, but you can ask around like, hey, I want to start this, but like, let's be honest, I just need like, I don't know, a few $100s. Who knows, right? Who knows who could like actually support you? So I think that, again, obviously you're not like wanting to go out there and just like begging people for money, but if you create a pitch, right? If all this planning and all of that stuff, then there like opportunities might present themselves.
And then we do have a few questions about recommendations, and I know we're running out of time, but let me ask you both, because someone has asked about your favorite science podcasts.
Jackson, do you want to go first on this one?
yeah, see, this is tough because my answer is generic because it is, I think, the most popular science podcast in the world right now. But I'm a sucker for ologies. I just get really, really engaged with ologies. And I think the reason why is that it has a really unique approach to science communication. So that'd probably be my answer. Third pod from the sun. Of course.
Thanks, Jackson. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm literally going through my list right now. I'm on two sides of it. So this is like pretty kind of a controversial thing. So I'm a huge fan of Radiolab, and people who are like into podcasts, a lot of them are like, oh my gosh, like it's so produced and it gets away from science and all of that. I'm a storyteller first and foremost, and I love a good podcast that tells a good story. I don't care. So that I like it. I will say, and also this is the disclaimer, like I work for this organization outside of AGU. I also work for the Story Collider, if any of you have heard of that. And I was drawn to Story Collider because these are people, they're recorded stories, first person stories from anyone, scientists or not, who tell stories about science. And the whole idea is that anyone, no matter what their background is affected by science. And that, as a storyteller, as a person, that speaks to me. And it's just an added benefit that they're recorded. So yeah, I think there's so many good ones out there, though. I mean, the cool thing about podcasts too is you can listen to a few, and if it's not your jam, then you stop subscribing and try something else. So I think, and again, Google is your friend. There are lots of lists out there, lots of people who are doing this type of thing, creating lists on good podcasts. So look around, try some things. If you like it, great. If you don't, that's cool too. There's literally thousands of other options out there.
I'll say we've also seen some comments, suggestions that we should, Shane, start doing some sort of workshopping of people's podcast episodes to provide feedback. And I think that's a great idea that we will have to explore as and when we feel we have the capacity.
Or frankly, the expertise.
That too.
I can talk about this from a personal level, but I don't know. I'm a bit humble on it. Like I've done a lot for, like we've done a lot for AGU, right? But like, I don't know if I'm ready to. Always happy to help and offer suggestions, but yeah, be a definitive source. I don't know.
In any case, I think we are probably at time, so we'll try to follow up with any other questions in the follow-up email that everyone will receive. That'll include the recording of the webinar, but give us a little while because it takes a bit to process the recording and so forth and have that link for you.
Yeah, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Jackson, for stopping in today. It's always nice to get a different perspective.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, thank you all again, and we'll be in touch shortly.